Okay, we are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have a very special guest, a recommended guest. Somebody's recommended to me, and it was a very good recommendation. Her name is Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins. Her last name is spelled Towner-Watkins. And I was kind of following up on this. I know a lot of people in kind of the research community talks about Gladio, but she was recommended to me as kind of a global Gladio. So I spent today kind of researching, and I listened to a really great presentation by Matthew Arrett, who's been on my show. And I think it was either the Canadian Patriot or Rising Tide Foundation. And she was the featured guest, and the title was Gladio and JFK. But it covered a lot of territory, things I didn't know, some of the stuff I did. And I heard the Knights of Malta mentioned, so that was interesting. I've done like 10 shows and very detailed 400 slide presentation on Knights of Malta, even up to today, because the current Pope met with the head of the Knight of Malta, who's actually Canadian, believe it or not. Oh, he's the first I think, European as the head of the Knights of Malta, a millennia old organization with a lot of kind of these characters who are involved in Gladio or also involved in that. And she talked about today in the discussion I heard with her and Matt that a lot of them became knights, either were knighted who weren't usually let into the Knights of Malta. It's used to be a very kind of a like aristocratic kind of thing. Like you've seen the Queen of Elizabeth. I have a picture of her with the Maltese cross, very distinctive cross. But there's like a lot of things going on. Like some of these other researchers who have said this strategy of tension is still kind of maybe being implemented in 2025. So what the knowledge of what Gladio is, Gladio, for people who don't know, is the old Roman sword. Believe it or not, the Romans didn't have these huge, like massive swords. They had kind of a medium-sized sword. It was called a Gladio. And it was very effective for close combat. And it kind of was a element of their imperial fights. But that's just a little bit of background. So I'm delighted to have her. So again, it's Colonel Towner-Watkins. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here. Thanks for the invite.
Cool, awesome. I like the fact that you're such a passionate researcher. I was looking through all the other kind of things that you had done. I was looking at your YouTube channel and all this stuff. Like you've done a lot of research. Maybe you can talk about your background, your research, and kind of what led up to like your interest in this particular topic.
Well, that's a very interesting story. So for those of you who don't know me, I spent 30 years in the Air Force, and I was not an intel officer. I was not a pilot. I was a support officer. I started off in aircraft maintenance when I enlisted in 1979. I spent 8 years doing that, turning wrenches, working on the flight line. But I have always been a very avid reader, and I've only really ever read nonfiction. And so I had an entire library of biographies of, leaders, SecDefs, Secretary of States, and that type of thing. And so about 3 years ago now, I was reading Anthony Sutton's trilogy about the funding of the Bolshevik Revolution, World War II, Hitler, and FDR. And it was information that I had never seen before. And so if you compile all of what I did know, I started kind of in my head filling in holes. And that led me to doing a little bit more research in non-approved books about World War II. And what I found out in reading books like Fascist International or Nazi International and some of the other books, Joseph Farrell's book about the Third Way, I realized that there has been a kind of what I refer to as a fake left and a fake right. In order to create these polar opposites, you don't want to go too far this way and you don't want to go too far this way. And it was used kind of just to herd the mass of people around the globe into a controlled setting. And psychological operations obviously is something in the military that we learn a lot about. So I started kind of putting all of this together. And in one of those books, it mentioned this thing called stay behind units. Now, I have 6 different degrees, and they're very diverse. But I spent a year at Air War College, and for someone like me and my background, with the extensive reading that I have done, to come across what was obviously a military operation that I've never heard of was quite interesting. So, of course, I start doing just some surface level research on this idea of stay behind units. And I find out the history goes back to the Boer Wars and Winston Churchill when he was a journalist, and the creation of the Jedburghs, which of course I had heard of, and the fact that Hitler and his intelligence operation ran by General Wolf and General Reinhard Gehlen set up stay behind units extensively throughout German occupied territory. They were called werewolf units. And again, up until 3 years ago, I didn't know any of this. This is not taught in any professional military education. Obviously, it's not a well-known fact in the United States at all. So I started doing a little bit more digging, and you find out that there was this secret meeting in northern Italy between General Wolfe, Allen Dulles, and a major general at the time by the name of Lyman Lemisker. And he was Eisenhower's chief of logistics. Now, for those of us in the military, we know they're critical, a critical element of implementing any plan that you have. At this meeting, there was discussion about turning over the plans and the layout of this extensive stay-behind network that was laid in Romania and Hungary and Ukraine and all of these German-occupied territories. At least at one point, they were German-occupied territories. But it was in France, it was in the Netherlands, and I started, again, just kind of digging into it. And I come across Paul Williams' book called Operation Gladio, and Danielle Ganser, who we talked about before the show, his book is called NATO Secret Army. So those were the 2 first books that I highly recommend if you're interested in the topic to read. And it makes clear that this critical meeting with Allen Dulles is pivotal to the transferring of this stay behind network. And let me just explain what that is real quick. They created these small units of anywhere from 15 to 20 men that they consolidated caches of weapons, explosives, comm equipment, and money. And at the beck and call of the senior leadership of the Nazi regime, they would activate these stay-behind units to fall in on these weapon caches and attack whoever the target was. And if you could imagine in Ukraine with the Bandera network and Stetsko and all of the people that Hitler and Otto Skorzeny, who was the trainer for these stay-behind units, they arranged for all of these weapons. So there's an entire network across Europe of these things. And this meeting was basically arranging the transfer of control of this network over to the US. And there was not any, there were a couple of other people at the meeting, but primarily they left the Soviet Union, who at the time was our ally, out of this planning meeting. So if you fast forward a little bit, you find out that also at that meeting, they were deciding who was going to go to Nuremberg and who wasn't. And there was going to be a concerted effort to save several, like a lot, of the Nazi upper echelon. And that was then going to be what we now commonly refer to as the rat lines into Spain, which at the time was under the fascist dictator Franco. and then on into South America. Well, that comes in the story later on under Operation Condor, because you will find out that Operation Gladio, while specifically is kind of a generic term, every country had their own name. Like in Turkey, it was called the Grey Wolves. In Portugal, it was called Agenter Press. But generically now, everybody just refers to it as Gladio. And so this network gets turned over to the U.S. They fly Reinhard Gehlen, dressed up as a U.S. general, into Washington, D.C. to go to the OSS headquarters and debrief him. And basically, they then assume control of this network and continue to further it. Now, it's originally done under the guise of fighting communism. And when I interviewed Paul Williams, who wrote the book Operation Gladio, my specific question to him was, do you believe that there was ever a communist threat? And basically, my kind of takeaway is, if you look at the state that we left the Soviet Union in after World War II, where, depending on who you read, the estimates is anywhere from 25 million to 50 million people had been killed. A lot of their manufacturing had been gutted by the Nazis. They're not a threat. They're not a threat to Europe. They're not a threat to anyone. So the fact that there's this extensive network under the guise of fighting communism in the immediate aftermath of the war is a little odd, because there was no threat. And what you find out, if you span out to the 30,000 foot look, every single one of these Gladio programs throughout Europe in the aftermath of World War II were used to create domestic terrorism against the people in Europe. And of course, the most well-known, well-documented example of that is in Italy, because, as you mentioned earlier, in 1990, on August 2nd, the Prime Minister of Italy, after a lot of exposure and research had went on, and the murder of journalists, judges that tried to do investigations, prosecutors that had done investigations in the late 70s and all of 80s, finally, a roster of all of the people that had been involved in it was discovered in a secret compartment of Lucio Gelli's, who was the Grand Mason of the P2 Masonic Lodge. And it had like 800 names on it. So now the cat's out of the bag. And there's lots of, so Andreotti, the prime minister, he gets up in front of the Senate in Italy and basically discloses the fact that Operation Gladio is real, and it was used extensively for domestic terrorism throughout Italy. There's a lot of people eventually sent to jail as a result of that. And it implicated the Vatican, because what you find out in the aftermath of World War II, in order to fund this extensive covert operation that couldn't necessarily be funded with money that was appropriated because it's secret, they had set up the most extensive drug trafficking network in the world out of Southeast Asia. And that's where people like Chiang Kai-shek, who was in a civil war with Mao in China, and the OSS, mainly people like Paul Helliwell, some of those names that are associated with the CIA in the aftermath. He was a military attaché, because he was a colonel, to Chiang Kai-shek. And what they observed in the Asian theater during World War II is Chiang Kai-shek was funding the war not just against Japan, but against Mao by selling opium. And so Paul Halliwell picks up the phone to Alan Dulles and he goes, "Hey, I think I got our funding thing resolved. All we have to do is take care of Chiang Kai-shek and find a place for him to hang out. And we can sell opium that's grown over here in Asia, ship it, and we'll just take money off the top because it's illicit drugs and it's, covert funding. So let's just marry these two covert programs, and we've got a funding source, and then we can equip all of these covert Gladio operations with that money. And so initially they decide to set up, because they've not given up on China. They want China. So they set Chiang Kai-shek up in Burma along the Chinese border, and they're running missions into China. This is after World War II. So they're running missions into China, attacking Mao. And so Mao has decreed that there's no opium. It's all gone. There's not going to be any drugs in China. So he's basically eliminating a major source. So they start growing the poppy in Burma, which is where they set Chiang Kai-shek up initially. Well, the Burmese government gets tired of all of the weapons and the murders and everything else. And so the CIA now decides they're going to move Chiang Kai-shek to this little island off the coast of China called Formosa. And we're going to change the name of it, and we're going to call it Taiwan. And so as soon as Chiang Kai-shek gets there, the Formosans are like, we don't want that guy here. He's a drug dealer. And at the time, depending on who you read, between 80 and 90% of the opium supply in the world was being generated by Chiang Kai-shek.
Wow,
and so so you have this entire network of U.S., the ambassadors, the CIA station chief, everybody. They fall in on Formosa. They prop up Chiang Kai-shek. He immediately declares martial law because the Formosans are rebelling. They're like, we don't want you here. And so if you said anything out loud about Chiang Kai-shek that was negative, you would get murdered. And there are declassified State Department cables from the ambassador that depict him looking out his window and watching these new quote unquote Taiwanese Chiang Kai-shek KMT military people bayoneting people in the streets in front of the U.S. Embassy. So it's terror unleashed on the island of Formosa to subdue the rebellion. And there's people like William Polly. I'd never heard of this guy. And if you look up William Polly, it's one of the most interesting stories. He is instrumental. He is given the Curtiss aircraft franchise in Southeast Asia. So he starts manufacturing all kinds of military aircraft to supply Chiang Kai-shek with aircraft. You have the creation of the China Lobby. You have Claire Chennault, a major general, who is instrumental in creating what eventually becomes Air America, the civil air transport company that flew a lot of the drugs around. It's just like this entire industry pops up in Southeast Asia. And so, and the people that are involved in it is just, you could do a whole show just on that part of it.
Right. It's a huge operation, right?
It is. Yeah. So now we need a bank to launder the money through. Well, they picked the Vatican because the Vatican is a sovereign. The bank is a sovereign within a sovereign. So you have a sovereign bank within a sovereign territory, and it just is conveniently located in Italy when they decide that the U.S. portion of this opium operation is they want to use Sicily because we basically controlled the mafia through Lucky Luciano and all of those people with their Sicilian mafia ties. And so it's just very convenient. However, at the time we were competing with the French because we decided that after World War II, we were going to give the French back Vietnam instead of allowing them to be free. And so they're doing opium out of Laos, and it's going to the Corsican mafia in France. And so we found a guy, his last name is Koenig, and he's actually a CIA agent, but he is working kind of undercover with the Corsican mafia. And so he's mapping out the whole Corsican mafia. And if you fast forward a few decades, we declare a war on drug under the Nixon administration. And basically what that did was to take out the entire Corsican mafia. And so basically it was a war on competition, not an actual war on drugs. And so now we've got it all consolidated. We've got control over the source. We've got control over the transformation of it into actual heroin. And then we have the supply network of the mafia connections that was all set up at several meetings in Cuba, because Cuba was going to be a hub. And Paul Williams mentions the fact that out of Sicily, they were, after they would refine it, they would hide it in plastic oranges, in crates of oranges going into Cuba. And I had one of my listeners go, oh, well, that explains all the oranges in the Godfather series. And what they said, and it is true because I went back and watched it, all of the murder scenes in the Godfather where they were talking about taking someone out, there's either oranges on the table or the guy that gets shot falls back into a bunch of oranges. And I had
Corleone sucking on an orange, or
yes.
when the Godfather gets shot in the first one, he falls into an orange crate,
yes.
if you remember that. Yeah.
And so I had, when we were first going through Paul Williams' book on my Rumble channel, I had somebody go, hey, did you ever figure out what the orange thing was? And I'm like, I don't even know what you're talking about. And they're like, well, it's in all the death scenes. And so then, you know, I went back and I reread Paul Williams' book, and he actually even talks about it. And I'm like, holy crap, I missed that part. So lots of very interesting connections. And so now we've got the funding source, we've got the money launderer, and we've got this entire network being built out. And as I mentioned, I thought originally, when I was first doing this research, that they created these networks that operated exclusively within these countries, like Gladio inside of Italy, a Ginger Press inside of Portugal. But what you find out is people like Otto Skorzeny, who did go to Nuremberg, but he was found, quote unquote, innocent.
Right. He's one of the miracle guys who got away with it. He was involved in so much underhanded stuff. I had a guest on who wrote a book about him called The Devil's Disciple, because he rescued, for people who don't know, he rescued Mussolini. He was involved in Battle of the Bulge, of like fake stuff and just all kinds of on the Eastern Front, possibly involved in like burning down synagogues. Like, wow, he's something else.
Yes, he is something else. So this network set him up. Originally, he went to Paris because that's where they're going to set up NATO. And he was going to be, because eventually NATO takes over. When NATO stands up, NATO's in charge of the Gladio program. There were two organizations inside of NATO. One was called the Allied Clandestine ACC Committee, and then the CPC, the Clandestine Planning Committee. And these two entities, which are covered in Danielle Ganser's book, were the kind of coordination body for Operation Gladio. So they're going to have Otto Skorzeny be their trainer, because he trained all of the Hitler Gladio people. That's what he did working for Reinhard Gehlen. And so they're going to put him in Paris, so he's close. But he has this huge scar on his face, and he's immediately recognized. So they're like, okay, well, that's not going to work. We're going to put him in Spain because Franco will protect him. And he did. And so he gets a partner, and he sets up a construction company. But we've got to figure out a way to pay him. And we really don't want to use all these covert funds, because this is going to be an ongoing thing. So let's figure out how we're going to pay him. Well, it just so happens that he is paid out of the Department of Defense construction business called Logistics. Hello, Lyman Lemonsker, to build bases in Spain. Now, first of all, being a military officer, my first question was, why are we building bases in Spain when it's a fascist dictator? I thought we didn't like those people. Didn't we just fight a war to get rid of one? Yes, we did. But we don't care, because we're looking for an illicit way to channel money to Otto Skorzeny. And so, weirdly enough, Otto Skorzeny gets the contract to build all of the U.S. military bases in Spain. And it's grossly overpriced. So that was the way we ended up paying Otto Skorzeny to be the trainer for NATO. So he sets up all over the border near France these terrorist training camps, because that's what they are. They're terrorists. And so they're producing, and there were several of them. The school that specialized in kidnapping was on Sardinia, the island off the coast of Italy, which just so happens to be around the coast from France. They used the Canary Islands to do the water, how you can, be like a scuba diver and come up on a boat and kill people. Weirdly enough, Robert Maxwell gets murdered off the coast of the Canary Islands on his boat. I don't know that there's a connection, but I do find that really weird. So all of these operations are being set up and the people are going through the training. But then what I noticed is Otto Skorzeny is involved in a whole bunch of operations that's nowhere near Europe. He's in Algeria. He ends up in the Congo when we killed Patrice Lumumba. He was in charge of that operation. And
that was in the 60s. Was it 61 that Lumumba got killed?
3 days before JFK took office, Eisenhower signed the finding that authorized the execution of Patrice Lumumba. Wow. Yeah. And so now I'm getting a different sense of Operation Gladio, totally, because it wasn't just confined to Europe. And you find two of the gray wolves out of Turkey are the two guys that eventually were convicted of shooting the Pope in Italy. And so now we've got an international terrorist organization. And so again, I just continue kind of looking this. And then I find out Otto Skorzeny travels to Latin America all the time. Well, isn't that where we ratlined all of his buddies? Yes, it is. Yes. Yeah. And then what you find out is that a lot of the beginnings of the CIA coups all over South America begin happening. And so you look at Brazil, you look at Guatemala. So Guatemala happens the year after we couped Iran in 1953. So it happens in 1954. Then in 1963, we overthrow Brazil. We overthrow 10 years later Chile. We're instrumental in the coup in Paraguay and Uruguay, and it just goes on and on and on. And that portion of it was labeled Operation Condor. And when you start looking into all of those operations, you find out that there's a company by the name of Crypto AG. I stumbled across that looking into Operation Gladio. And I'm like, what the hell is that? So Crypto AG was a program that was developed by a Swedish guy for the Allied forces in World War II. It was used as an encrypted device to communicate. After World War II, they set him up in business, they being the intelligence agencies, set him up in business in Switzerland. Now, all of his... Was it
like sorry to interrupt, but was it like a typewriter, kind of like Enigma or something like that?
Not really. It's more like a capability, and it was housed in all... So I'll explain what they used it for, but they set him up in business in Switzerland. And because it's quote unquote neutral. And he began selling this capability to eventually over 100 countries around the world. And what it did was when a country bought it, they put it in their version of the State Department. And then they put another terminal that connected to that terminal in all of their embassies around the world. What none of the countries that had this capability knew is there was a back door to it. And the CIA was able to listen to every encrypted cable from the country of origin to their embassy and back. So from the end of World War II until it was finally gotten rid of in 2020. Every single country that bought this system was monitored by the CIA. Now, this guy gets old and he has a son that's helping him run his country or company. But the CIA doesn't trust his son with the knowledge because his son doesn't know about the back door. And so they decide they're going to buy the company from the old man. And they went in a partnership with the German B&D. Now, why is that important? Because the German B&D was ran by Reinhard Gehlen, Otto Skorzeny's old boss.
Right.
So now you have the Nazis in Reinhard Gehlen, supposedly in denazified West Germany, and the CIA in bed with each other, eavesdropping on all of the communications.
Incredible.
Now, what that requires you to do is go back and look at what countries had it and what were we told about all of these countries. And I'll give you an example. So Iran bought it. So we knew everything that was going on in Iran, that they communicated with any of their ambassadors around the world. Egypt bought it. So if you go up to 1967, where supposedly the 6-day war with Israel, everybody sold at the time the idea that Egypt was about to attack Israel and they just preemptively attacked them. Well, they knew damn good and well Egypt wasn't going to attack Israel, because they knew that Egypt had already deployed 75,000 of their army down to Yemen because the British had got into a fight with them down there with the Yemenis. And so if you go back and you start re-looking at history and you know what countries had this equipment, all of the false pretenses of, you know, whether it's the Korean War, the Vietnam War, or whatever, we were spying on all of them. We knew everything. So they've crafted this version of history that defies logic once you understand the underpinnings of this. And so the use of crypto AG in Latin America was throughout all of Latin America. All of Latin America basically had bought this equipment. And so all of the overthrows of the governments, and we were sold the coup in Guatemala, the coup in Brazil, the coup in Chile, the coup in Uruguay. I could go down the whole list. We were told that the reason the CIA behind the scenes supported the overthrow of those governments is because they were communist leaning or communist sympathizers. They knew damn good and well there was no communication going on between the Soviet Union and any of these countries from the top presidential level, because they had access to every single cable transmitted. So, yeah. So literally, when you get done with the investigation into Operation Gladio, you realize the entire history that we've been told and sold is a lie. All of it's a lie.
Right.
And so I have to cover this one aspect of it. So at some point, about 1.5 years into this, I had two questions. Danielle Ganser says there was a secret agreement of all NATO countries that you had to have a Gladio network. So question number one was, where's ours? We're a member of NATO. Where's ours?
CAPS, Civilian Air Patrol, or I don't know, something like that. I've heard that people have said Civilian Air Patrol was set up by a couple of generals, that it was something like a Gladio, but I don't know. Do you know?
Well, I'm going to make an argument of what I believe it was. Also, who's doing this? Who benefits from all of this? Who benefits from the instability around the world of overthrowing governments? Well, the best example of looking into who benefits is the Congo assassination of Lumumba and Chile assassination of Salvador Allende. And
that's 71. Sorry to interrupt, but That was the original 9/11, was the overthrow of the Chilean government.
So I think it was in 73.
Okay, sorry.
I think he got elected around 71, but you can
I'll look it up.
Yeah. So in Chile, there is actual documents now that proves U.S. corporations' involvement with the CIA, because what Salvador Allende wanted to do is he supported legitimate unions, because one of their biggest export at the time was copper, and the U.S. had a concession under Freeport mining to that copper mine down
I think
there.
it was the biggest copper mine in the world they had.
It was at the
and
time.
you were right. It was 1973. Excuse me.
So they had a big beef with Salvador Allende because they didn't want to pay minimum wages. They did not want to have unions organizing against them for better working conditions, because they didn't give a crap if the people died in the copper mines, and they were dying all the time. Also, a U.S. corporation, ITT, owned the entire telecommunication and telegraph capability in Chile. And PepsiCo had a lock on all of their soda beverages. So PepsiCo, ITT, and Freeport goes to Nixon and says, we want him gone. And he was assassinated. So now when I get to in an in-depth research into Chile, I'm like, okay, hold up. Let me go back to all of these other ones that I've done, like the Congo with Lumumba. What resources did they have? They had the #1 uranium mine in the entire world. Now, they had been a former Belgian colony, and the Belgium mining company had the concession in Katanga, which was the area where all of the minerals, most of the minerals in the Congo was. And Belgium had signed a contract with US that they get 100% of the uranium out of the Congo. So Lumumba flies to Washington, D.C., and after he becomes prime minister, and he says, you know what? I'm fine with that. I'll give you 100% of the uranium, but I don't want to be paying what the Congo should be getting in the concession to Belgium. I want to cut Belgium out of it because we're not a Belgium colony anymore. They have no rights to our minerals. Not only would Eisenhower not meet with him, Vice President Nixon at the time would not meet with him. And he does finally get a meeting with the Secretary of State, and he's a prime minister of a foreign country.
Massive country, yeah. With massive resources,
Yes.
Resources.
The Secretary of State tells him to pound sand. We're not interested. We're not cutting Belgium out. So Patrice Lumumba goes home and he says, okay, I'm kicking Belgium out of the country. Belgium at the time was still 100% their military. And Belgium comes back and says, no, our officers are not leaving. If you want to fill the ranks of the enlisted with Congolese, that's fine. But our Belgium officers aren't leaving. And Patrice Lumumba says, I'll check you on that one. You're all leaving. And what they did with Otto Skorzeny is they send him to Katanga. They set up at that time, one of the largest NATO installations in Katanga. And they pay the president, which at the time was kind of like a figurehead of the Congo, and the guy in Katanga that was basically like functioning as the governor of that area, to create a civil war. And it's actually NATO fighting in Katanga against the Congolese. And immediately the guy that's their stooge there, he declares Katanga a separate country, plants a flag, says we're a separate country. Immediately, all of NATO and the US recognize Katanga as a separate country. And so they basically then plot the kidnapping of Lumumba. They kill him. He's driven around in the trunk of a CIA car for 2 weeks. They bury him, and then they decide, well, we can't bury him because if anybody finds him, they'll martyr him, and it's just going to be more chaos. So how about if we unbury him and we dissolve his body in acid so no one's going to find him? And that's what they did. And we didn't know most of that until a few years ago when the Belgium, one of the Belgium enlisted people that was on that operation, he had kept one of Lumumba's gold teeth.
Wow.
And he returned it to the family.
That's dark. Yeah, they put him in a 50-gallon drum, almost like a mob hit or something, like super dark.
So this is basically this worldwide terror network in operation, funded out of NATO and all of these intelligence agencies with illicit drug. And so then you start going, well, wait a minute. Is everything that we've done in the military about drugs? Because you look at Vietnam and then you look at Afghanistan 1. After we get into Afghanistan, the opium production goes off the roof. And Afghanistan 2 is in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. And you go back and you look, and I did the chart, the UN shows after the Taliban, after Afghanistan 1 is over, which was 100% CIA, you have the production of opium go to almost zero in Afghanistan. The Taliban outlaws it. So in the year 2000, the lowest amount of opium production in Afghanistan occurs. And what happens the next year? 9/11. What happens then? We go back into Afghanistan. And what happens to the opium production? It's off the chart. It goes, yeah, it goes higher than it had ever been prior to 9/11. So now I'm going, what the hell? And then you look at Latin America. What happened when we went and destabilized all of those countries? Oh, well, and I just found out they actually had a name called the Crystal Triangle. So you have the
cocaine, right?
Yeah.
So, you
got so now we're
it's literally involved. Like, do you know that, as you probably know this, but maybe the listeners don't, Pablo Escobar, literally, I think he was Klaus Barbie was enlisted by him. It was another paperclip Nazi who was in Ecuador or something like that, or Peru. I forgot which one, but like literally it was like these rat-lined Nazis were still around. Barbie was involved in politics. Like, it's incredible.
Yes. So I just did a bunch of shows, and we're doing a book right now about the cocaine wars in Colombia. What most people don't know about Pablo Escobar and the reason why he was assassinated is Pablo Escobar was a drug dealer, but he was not one of the CIA drug dealers, and he refused to play the CIA game. Pablo Escobar was referred to in Colombia as the Robin Hood of the drug dealers. He reinvested all of his proceeds in Colombia. He built schools, he built cities, he built houses. Well, that's not the whole idea of the drug trade. The whole idea of the drug trade is to launder your money into the United States and buy real estate. So he was on the outs of the Medellin cartel, was on the outs of the Cali cartel. And so the CIA gets in bed with the Cali cartel and basically marginalizes the Medellin cartel. So Noriega got it caught in the middle of that. Obviously, we overthrew his government.
Sorry, Klaus Barbie was in Bolivia. I got it wrong, but he had some kind of connection to Escobar.
So Bolivia was the country where a lot of the coca plants, and I didn't know this until recently, coca plants were grown throughout Latin America and sold internationally for medicinal purposes and tea. So it was a legitimate crop for like 100 years longer. And someone figured out with a whole bunch of chemicals that you could convert coca leaves into cocaine. Now, if you honestly wanted to fight a war against drugs, and you know that the production from a coca leaf to cocaine requires tons and tons of chemicals, would you cut the chemicals off? Do you think we did? No, because US corporations were shipping the chemicals down there, and they shipped them in large part through Brazil, which we controlled by this point, into Colombia for the production. So there's never been an honest effort to actually eradicate drugs from anywhere in the world. And every time someone successfully did it, like Evo Morales gets elected president of Bolivia, he kicks out USAID, he kicks out all of the US funded NGOs, and he reverts back, because he was a cocoa dealer himself, he reverts back to the traditional use of cocoa plants. He does not make them illegal. And he basically goes on to, but he was a thorn in the CIA side because they were getting a lot of the coca leaves from Bolivia. So of course they're at odds with him. But every single time someone tries to eliminate a drug supply from anywhere, the CIA goes in and takes them out.
Wow, it's incredible. And it's just all part of this kind of underground global network of like malefactors all over that really aren't limited to NATO. So global Gladio is more accurate.
It's an effort for what I refer to as the international syndicate, which is this group of oligarchs that want to control all of the resources. So if a country is discovered to have a resource that you want and you don't control the government, and it doesn't matter if that resource is drugs or the resource is gold or the resource is uranium, it doesn't matter. If they have a resource you want, copper, you just go in and overthrow the government. And then the US goes in and plunders the country. That's what's going on in Ukraine. That's why I say none of this stuff ever stopped. If right now, what are they trying to do to Donald Trump? He will not play along with them. And they have done literally everything they can. They tried to coup him at least 4 times during his first administration. They tried to assassinate him at least 2 times that we all know about. If you don't play their game, they will take you out.
Same thing's happening in Syria, by the way. Like they just tried to destabilize Syria forever.
Assad was one of the last men standing in their global game. Now we have Putin as one of the last man standing, and they've surrounded him with NATO, and they have launched repeated attacks. The whole Chechnya thing, that was an Operation Gladio. All of those quote unquote Muslims were trained by the Mujahideen in Tajikistan and some of the other former Soviet areas, and they were piped into Chechnya to create the Chechnyan War.
Fascinating. I think they tried to kill Putin too. I'm pretty sure that there was at least one assassination.
Sure tried at least a couple of times.
Yeah. So it's just astonishing the kind of how this goes. Have you ever heard of the group Combat 18? It was supposedly a Gladio group in England. Does that sound familiar to you?
I've heard of it. I've not done a lot of research into it. England has several entities that they use internal to England.
They all do, and they have different code names and stuff like that. I remember Ganser talking about that.
Yes.
Like they all have different. But some of the most stark things were in Italy, where they had like years of lead, and these Gladio groups were assassinating people and terror.
The only reason we know so much about Italy is because after 1990, when Andreotti exposed the whole thing, they went through about 15 years of trials and exposés and the revelation. Well, what was funny about his, and just for the audience, the reason why I knew this was something that God wanted me to research, when I read Paul Williams' book, I got to the part where he's talking about Andreotti's speech to the Senate, and it happened on the 2nd of August of 1990. And the reason why that date sticks in my mind is because my plane landed in Italy the morning of the 2nd of August 1990 for my 3-year assignment in Italy. I walked off the airplane into the Rome airport, and it is filled with carabinieri with AK-47s. And I've got my daughter, who's like 10 years old, with me, and I'm going, what the hell have I done? Because I had a choice. I didn't have to go to Italy. Is this what Italy looks like? What I didn't know at the time, until I got to Brindisi's airport in southern Italy, which was near where my base was going to be, is that's the exact same day Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. So, yeah, and what was that all about? That was a NATO operation in which the week before, April Gillespie, who was at the in Iraq as the quote unquote ambassador, basically gave Saddam Hussein the permission to go into Kuwait.
I remember that.
And so if you're NATO and you knew that you were about to get exposed, would you want a distraction?
Yes, absolutely.
And it just so happens to happen on the exact same day.
Unbelievable. Yeah, it's hard to believe that's chance. Did you ever look into the death of Aldo Moro? Was that actually done by leftists?
No, it was not. It was 100%. As a matter of fact, just before he was actually abducted, there was another plan by the CIA to do that was called off at the last minute.
Interesting. It's supposedly called off. He was abducted, but he was kind of like a Christian.
No. There was a separate, he was going to do a unified government. You're not allowed to have a unified anything because then there's going to be people talking. They had a separate plan that was called off. He actually was abducted. He was murdered. And there's a whole long story about that, but it was 100% part of the strategy of tension. And the same thing with Olof Palme in Sweden.
Yeah, Olof Palme, Palme.
Yes.
Yeah, I've done a show on that too. That's an interest. Never. Wow. And nobody, and it's totally done by right wingers, but nobody ever got arrested. It's really their JFK.
Yes. And his assistant was also gunned down.
With a very high caliber gun, or like something just really crazy. Like,
yes.
I've done a show on that. The guy who wrote, I don't know if you know this, but the guy who wrote The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, whose name escapes me now, he also did a huge investigation into Palme. And really fascinating stuff, but it all led back to these Gladio types, right wingers, hard rightists. Palme was a leftist, right? Walking in.
Well, but see, I don't use. I never used.
He was liberal.
Words.
What's the term? He was he wasn't a fascist.
He was a nonconformist.
Right, nonconformist. These are actual. One of the interesting things is that these are actual fascists. These aren't like somebody name calling somebody a Nazi or fascist. A lot of these guys are literal fascists.
No, they are 100%. Yeah. And that's why that Nazi International, if you go back and you look at the Fabian Society in the late 1800s, they actually talk about the fact that we're going to have 3 world wars and we're going to basically implement one world government. They talked about it back then. And they were going to use fascist dictatorships around the world in order to implement this. They love them.
Yeah, no, it's incredible.
So let me get to the second point of who our Gladio operatives are. So I began looking into terrorism in the United States, and you come up with several themes. So if you look at one of the common denominators between JFK's assassination and RFK's assassination and the murder of the Chilean ambassador Letelier in the car bomb.
Letelier. It's a really good book. Really good book I recommend, who I've had as a guest. His name is McPherson, and it's called The Ghost of Sheridan Circle, because it was one of the circles in D.C. It's the only assassination of a diplomat in the history, I think, of DC or the United States or something like that. But
So what you find is the common denominator, the overthrow of Nixon during Watergate. What you find is as a common denominator is a group of Cuban exiles in Miami, all of which were trained by the CIA. And you also find that those Cuban exiles were deployed all over the world. They were in El Salvador, they were in Nicaragua, they were in Guatemala, they were in Angola. They were in Vietnam, they were in the Philippines. They have been a global terrorist organization that was set up and trained exclusively by the CIA. And they were implicated in many of what I would refer to as Gladio style operations in the United States. And to that point, Lyman Lemonsker, the guy I talked about that was at that secret meeting, he goes on to be a 4-star general. He is the chief of staff when JFK becomes president. Lyman Lemonsker wrote Operation Northwood. That was his product in coordination with Allen Dulles. And what it does is it lines out several Gladio operations that can be conducted inside the United States, like bombing cities dressed up as Cuban military so we can justify a full ground invasion of Cuba. So he's actually writing a document to implement Operation Gladio style domestic terror events because he's very familiar with Gladio. He helped set it up at the post-World War II operations. And then JFK is so appalled by the fact that a general would write something like that. But the Bay of Pigs had just happened, so he doesn't want to fire him and make him retire. So he reassigns him from chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And do you know where he put him?
No, I don't.
He becomes the chief of NATO.
Wow. Yeah. Wow.
And NATO's running Operation Gladio, and less than a year later, he's dead.
JFK's dead, yeah.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Like, I mean, for people who don't know, Letelier was underling of Allende, who actually was very much involved in the copper trade. He was involved in redistributing that wealth that was there, trying to get it back to the people of Chile. But it was Cuban. It was four Cuban guys also involved in Watergate and just so many other things. Like there's supposedly Cubans at JFK assassination. I think one you even mentioned was Rodriguez was involved, I think, with Stone Cold, involved in killing Guevara and wore Che Guevara's watch. I don't know if he's still alive, but I think you mentioned that Tucker Carlson interviewed him.
Yes,
but you wonder how smart Carlson is sometimes because he didn't get into the nitty gritty. It's almost like he covered for him by not asking really hardcore intel questions, which I think Carlson should know. He's a member of the Pilgrim Society, among other things, a Metropolitan Club. Like he's a blue blood all the way. Parading, he's like the most plastic everyman created. Like it's all imaged for me.
I'm wondering if he's parading these people in front of Americans to get them to do their own research. Because the very first post I made after listening to that interview was to Tucker Carlson saying, you need to fire your security.
Right. I don't know. That's a good question. It's a mystery. Like sometimes you get in front of these people and their responses to things. I remember when Carlson was interviewing Putin, and Putin really was trying to talk about Russian history, and Carlson was like, what the hell is this guy trying to do? But Carlson was the intermediary between Putin explaining things to the American people because we're in freaking Mockingbird. We don't know squat about what's going on in the world.
Correct.
Intentionally. So it is a mystery. I mean, it's incredible when you think, like, I've heard of like guys like, who's it, Jose Gallison, that McVeigh is American Operation Gladio, was destabilizing, and that a lot of these white supremacist groups are already infiltrated and they're creating this tensions that people can then strike back at them or do something in that. I mean, McVeigh's an intel, and this Strassmeyer guy.
The Strassmeyer guy is tied directly to Germany's. His grandfather was part of Operation Gladio under Hitler, his
See,
grandfather.
there you go. Yeah.
And he went back to work for the German BND.
Bundesnachdienst or something like that. Yeah. I mean, this people can't believe it, like these cover stories.
But
But here's, yeah, that's like that whole era, though, was this destabilization, psychological warfare.
to create a narrative of white Christian nationalists as domestic terrorists. The Ruby Ridge, Waco, and it had to be Christian, white Christian nationalist or terrorist. And you had Ruby Ridge, Waco, and Oklahoma in quick series
I
to
think
create
today is the anniversary of Ruby Ridge, I think. Ruby, and that was also an intel op all the way. I mean, they framed that guy.
Correct.
They like turned him into church. Like, hey, can you give me a sawed-off shotgun? I mean, yeah.
They tried to recruit him, and he told them no.
Right. Yeah, like, I'm not part of this. What's your take on McVeigh? Is he an asset?
So at some point he was co-opted. I don't know at what point that happened, but he was not a kind of a stooge. He was not. If you go back and you look at the way the entire thing unfolded, he was a knowing participant in that operation.
Interesting. You're right. So, like, he knew he was in an operation. He wasn't a white supremacist. He was kind of playing a role or a persona or something.
Correct.
Now, I think he visited Bill Cooper, and then they aced Cooper too. I think right after 9/11, actually. Or that's a whole nother story, questionable story. So it's just so crazy. And then, like, people are saying, like, some researchers saying what's happening now is this reiteration of the strategy of tension and the years of
100% is.
Okay, so you believe that, yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I don't believe it ever went away.
Interesting. And they're running it for their own advantage and to destabilize society.
Look what they did in Ukraine.
Right.
We go in there in 2004 and overthrow the government. We go there in 2014 and we overthrow the government. And who do we use? We use Azov Battalion and Right Sector, both of which are the modern day Nazis in Ukraine. Igor Kolomoisky becomes the governor post 2014 of the region right next to the Donbass region. And what's his first act as governor? He brings all of the Azov battalions in as his quote unquote security. Well, who do you need security from? Those Azov battalions immediately work with the CIA, and this came out in the New York Times. They build over, I think it was 14 is what they said, secret underground sites along the Donbass region, and then immediately start attacking the Donbass region. Why? Because they wanted to provoke a war with Russia. That went on from 2014 until 2022. And Putin told Tucker that one of his primary goals was to denazify Ukraine, and he wasn't kidding.
He stated that over and over in public speeches.
Yes.
Especially, like, I think when the war started February 2022, he stated that as well. So
there is modern day Gladio going on all the time.
All the time, like secret financing, secret agendas. Did you ever tie the Brabant killings? Was it 82 to 85 to Gladio?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, so those are Gladio. That's another weird crime that nobody ever got caught for. Like, you went into supermarkets and blew people away in the most savage manner.
What you find some patterns in all of this is they love killing women and children because psychologically you get more bang for your buck than killing a guy. And they love targeting music venues like Las Vegas and like the October 7th in Israel, because you get young people, a lot of females, and then you get more bang for your psychological buck.
Yeah. 10/7 was a total inside job, total false flag attack. Like, those were all people that Netanyahu and his crew hate. It's a bunch of like pinko left wing, I don't know, whatever, non-fascist types. Yeah, it's just happening over and over and over. It's still current. But these Brabant killings actually popped back into the news within the last week because they have a new lead. So we'll see what happens with that. But those are extraordinary. And they blamed it on a gang or whatever. But it's like, these are so violent. Why would criminals who wanted to just steal stuff from a supermarket or thieves go in so hard and just kill people? Like,
what you find is that was there was a movement going on at the time in Belgium to try to get rid of NATO. And there were all kinds of unrest there. They have two distinct kind of what do you call it? Ethnic groupings.
Right. Flemish and Belgian or something like that.
Yeah. And so there was a lot of, again, it's strategy of tension. You play both sides so that you can control all of the people. And psychologically, when you have these terror events, you get complacent people because they want safety. And that's what that was all about.
Wow, it's incredible. It's just around. Like, I mean, some of these things I've always been suspicious about this guy Boltner who killed these two people in Minnesota, his background, what he was up to, the attempted killing of Fuentes. There's a lot of really strange things. That guy who tried to kill Fuentes, he was savage. He killed a lot of different people, and he was smart. He wore a motorcycle helmet to conceal his identity. Like, that's like somebody pre-thinking something, or I don't know where they come from. I got my list. It's Ruth and Crooks, and there was a recent one, Livelsberger, Jabbar. Like, when you look at them all, Luigi Mangione, like some of these guys are not. Mangione is very strange, but these guys came out of Fort Bragg. Like, they've been traced to Fort Bragg. Like, this is really dark stuff.
It is very dark stuff.
We're at the hour mark. I don't want to keep you too long. Do you have anything you'd like to add or anything I missed before?
No, I think we kind of covered the nuts and bolts of it. Obviously, I have hundreds of hours of shows. We've looked at everything. Not everything. We'll never look at everything, but we've looked at a lot of things. I also, on Wednesday night, have a show on the Alpha Warrior Show, and we've done like 60 some shows. We did Jonestown with Jim Jones. That totally was Gladio and MK Ultra operation. We went back and looked at the OJ Simpson
interesting
thing. Yeah. So
when you said the Alpha Warrior, so is that a podcast or is that on a
Alpha Warrior podcast? Yeah. Okay. That has kind of my late breaking. He has a huge audience. I don't. And so most of the most sensational things that I release, I do on his show. Gotcha. On my show, I basically do book reviews. That's kind of the deep, nitty gritty aspects of Operation Gladio. That's where I did Cynthia Chung's book, and I've done both volumes of Whitney Webb's book. We concentrate on going really in depth on my channel as an additional resource for people to be able to look at. And the best place to find me is on the Rumble channel, the Colonel's Corner, and also on X. It's at Colonel spelled out Towner.
At Colonel Towner. So I'll try to find a link to the Alpha Warrior, but I'll put a link to your Rumble and then your Twitter. And I've had a lot of your guests. I had Chip on, by the way. I talked to him too. Really good book. But Cynthia Chung's book is The Empire Upon Which the Sun Never Set. Is that right? That's
The Black Sun Never Set. Yeah.
The Black Sun. Thank you. Really good book too.
It is a very good book because it goes into the history of Gladio.
Yeah. Wow. Mind-blowing stuff. It really is happening worldwide. Like, this kind of thing is happening in the U.S. I think a lot of the stuff is it's artificial. It's not, somebody's pushing these guys to do stuff, or sometimes these guys are online and they have mysterious FBI or supposed FBI agents or all kinds of weird stuff like that. But thanks for sharing all of your knowledge and for doing your research. I'd have you back to talk about other things anytime. And again, the guest's full name is Colonel Roxanne Towner-Watkins. Last name is spelled Towner-Watkins. And we talked about global Gladio, and it's this intricate web of stuff that happened from World War II to the present. So thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
All right, stay there.